Hello again. Calls for women to be afforded menstrual leave are growing. Women's maternity leave policies and benefits in the country compare relatively well against many other countries, with expectant mothers entitled to 4 months of maternity leave. Well, it is Women's Month and it's about to end. That's the month of August here in South Africa. We're discussing some of the key points in relation to special leave and the current leave benefits for women in our country. Leila Moosa, Senior Associate in Employment Law Practice at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr, joining us now this hour. Leila, good afternoon. Welcome to today, and thank you very much for joining us on today. I want to start with an overarching question first, Leila. In our country currently, what are the leave benefits for women?
Right. So thanks very much for having me, Dan, this afternoon. So as a starting point, I think, we need to look at what we actually have from a legislative perspective. Within the South African landscape, we find our minimum floor of basic conditions of employment to be found in our Basic Conditions of Employment Act, right? And that minimum floor of benefits includes, from a woman's perspective, the only specific one that we categorize there is, for example, our maternity leave. Now that entitles persons who will bear children, and here, of course, this would extend to persons who are going to have a child who perhaps identifies non-binary or transgender men. But the important thing there is that entitles 4 months of consecutive maternity leave that is provided for. Now, we are seeing changes in terms of where these provisions are going from an international landscape. But from a South African perspective, we haven't necessarily seen anything imminent yet.
Okay. Yeah, before we look at it elsewhere, so the 4 months maternity leave sounds fabulous, but there's an element of pay around it. Some companies don't give you full pay, and they all differ. Does the law allow that differentiation of remuneration while on maternity leave?
Right, yes. So Dan, that's exactly it. So what is allowed or what is permitted in terms of our Basic Conditions of Employment is the fact that one gets those 4 consecutive months off from work. Now, an additional thing to remember there is that there's 6 weeks where an employee actually cannot return to work, where they cannot work for those first 6 weeks after giving birth. Now, in terms of pay, it's not required that employers pay the employee, and if they do, that's an additional contractual benefit. So what is required is that you have your 4 months off, and there can be any arrangement around what happens in those 4 months. And typically what would happen is where there's no enhanced contractual benefit, that one would be entitled to then claim from the Unemployment Insurance Fund in terms of that maternity benefit that is paid there.
Okay, so that gives us a sense of where we are at. But we could do better, because you were just mentioning, if you look at the international landscapes, there are new types of leave that are being implemented in other jurisdictions, overseas, for example, leave like menstrual leave. It's there if there's a doctor's note in some countries, because some women really battle. They have a hard time during their menstrual cycle.
Yeah. No, that's correct. So you're exactly right, Dan. We've seen in international landscapes, and again, I note that from a South African perspective, there's nothing imminent that we've seen in terms of our lawmaking process. So perhaps there it's slightly premature, but that's not to say that certain employers within the South African employment context are not considering this just from a contractual perspective, right? And there we look to see, well, what are they doing internationally, and what does this benefit actually look like internationally? And in some countries, it really flows almost from a benefit of sick leave, where one will require a doctor's certificate that entitles one to menstrual leave, where you experience painful menstruation. And the idea there is to accommodate that, to ensure that women are more accommodated in the workplace, or persons who menstruate are more accommodated in the workplace. But again, it's variation. Some countries are doing it with, just 1 day a month, irrespective of a doctor's note. Others, you've got to be certified by your medical practitioner, and then there's a certain limited entitlement. So that remains to be seen, but we're definitely seeing variations of it in different countries in the international landscape.
Yeah, should we be moving in that direction? I mean, you said it's too early, too premature. I mean, would you advocate, as an employment law specialist, that maybe some activists consider it, And also things like menopause leave, because menopause as well, for many women, comes with all kinds of complications and does not really start when you are old and retired. It can start at any point after 40, I'm told.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, if we look at what the purpose would typically be, it's really been pushed in the international landscape as something where, employers and jurisdictions are considering advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really looking at, well, what barriers are preventing persons, and this is in the totality of the workplace, from actually, entering the workplace, being retained in the workplace, and advancing in the workplace. And something like menstrual leave has come in to say, well, persons are coming to work and they're experiencing these painful menstruation, they're experiencing menopausal symptoms, and perhaps this is, a barrier to their advancement, to their retention within the workplace. So these jurisdictions or these employers are looking at, well, if we want to, be best practice, if we want to be looking at these elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion, how do we remove these barriers? How do we give people that time to actually be included, to be seen, to be allowed to actually openly communicate and say, well, this is what's happening. Either here's my doctor's note, or I'm going to take my day, depending on how it's done statutorily or contractually. And it's really providing for that. And we're seeing a massive advancement from an international landscape and within civil society for that. So it's really been positive feedback that we've seen internationally.
Thank you very much, Leila. What an interesting topic as we approach the end of Women's Month here in South Africa and looking at what's happening in the rest of the world. That's Leila Moosa, Senior Associate in Employment Law Practice at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr.